and we're going to give away a beautiful wood carving. I'll be around to distribute the cards momentarily. And we'll have some announcements about some important upcoming events. But on to Kathleen Folan. Anyway, Kathleen has a story you've never heard before. It's unique in the pro-life movement. I've been at it for about 40 years and had never heard a talk like this. Kathleen is a third order Dominican. She's the mother of 4. She's married to a wonderful doctor. She's from the university, went to the University of San Francisco when it was still sort of quasi-Catholic because of the St. Ignatius Institute founded by the great Father Joseph Fessio. Back in January of 2020, which seems like a million years ago, she actually addressed the West Coast March Walk for Life, they call it out there, right in San Francisco. Now, who can guess how many people would have been at the West Coast Walk for Life in downtown San Francisco? Take a guess. How many? What's your guess? Oh, you read the book. Okay. Yeah, there were somebody at the previous meeting said about 100. There were 60,000 people. So in spite of all the evil that's going on in San Francisco, there's some great things going on, and that's one of them. And another great thing that's going on is Kathleen Folan, who's in charge of youth and family formation at St. Dominic's Catholic Church, an oasis of Catholicism in that city of San Francisco. But there's some other good things going on there as well. Please welcome to Our Lady Center, Kathleen Folan.
There we go.
You're a good IT person.
Kinda, not really. I have college kids. Thank you, Jack, and thank all of you for being here. And I just want to say that in San Francisco, I'm not from there. I grew up in Spokane, Washington. I also found my faith there. And I think when there's so much against your faith, that's when you cling to it harder and rediscover it. Choose life. And as you know, as Jack said, I've traveled here from the once beautiful city of San Francisco. It's not so beautiful right now during the pandemic, but I believe it will be again, to share my story. Our city has officially declared itself pro-choice. I don't know if you know that. It happened about 15 years ago under Gavin Newsom, who's now our governor. And the flagship Planned Parenthood for the entire nation opened just last week, less than a mile from my work. But I'm happy to tell you that some of our strongest pro-life workers live in our city and are fighting the good fight. And one of my friends, Dolores, who is also one of the founders of the Walk for Life West Coast, after her funds are all raised and the pandemic ends, she will be opening Bella Clinic in the basement of the Archdiocese of San Francisco Chancery, which will help not just pregnant women before, during, and after childcare, but also those in need in our community with healthcare. So that is something to look forward to. Thank you all for being here and supporting life in every stage. As Jack said, my name is Kathleen Folan, and I'm the Director of Family and Youth Ministries at St. Dominic's Catholic Church in San Francisco, in the Pacific Heights neighborhood, a position I've held for 3.5 years. Prior to that, I was a stay-at-home mom for over 20 years that volunteered way too much, like a lot of moms, I'm sure, which is what led to getting my job at St. Dominic's. And I've been married to my husband, whom I also met in the St. Ignatius Institute at USF for over 25 years. I'm also a birth mother who had to make a choice, and this is the story I'll tell you today. Back when I was a junior at the University of San Francisco, I was locked out of my apartment one night, and I couldn't contact my roommates. We didn't have cell phones then. I decided to ask a friend of a friend, whom I didn't know well, if I could hang out at his place until I could locate my roommates. And he agreed. He made me dinner. I drank too much. And then we went to the campus bar, and I couldn't get in because I wasn't 21 yet. So he told me I could go back to his place, sleep in his bed, and he would sleep on the couch when he got back that night. And I believed him. But when he arrived back home, he raped me in a moment I'm glad I don't remember much of. I was mortified, as a lot of girls are, and I didn't tell a soul. I kept working 30 hours a week, studying 18 units, getting ready to attend Oxford University that spring, and working out every day and maintaining my active social life. I was also very close to God that year as I attended 10 p.m. Mass with other fellow students. 10 o'clock is a good time for students, not for me now anymore, and attended First Friday Adoration. A month later, I felt like I was getting the stomach flu, but I never did. After a couple of days of living on chicken broth and saltine crackers, I mentioned it to a roommate who joked, "Maybe you're pregnant." And she laughed because she knew I didn't do that. And that's when it dawned on me that she might be right. I hadn't even thought of that scenario. I had wiped that night from my mind and moved on with my life. I took a pregnancy test early the next morning, and the 3 minutes waiting for the result were some of the longest minutes of my life. In my mind, I already knew what the result would be, but as I turned it over and looked at the 2 blue lines, panic swept over me. It was positive. I was pregnant in 20. Fear gripped me, and I stared into the bathroom mirror, not recognizing the person looking back at me. This was not a part of my plan. This didn't fit into my almost perfect, all-American girl life. There was no father. I was still in school, earning a degree in philosophy, which, unless you become a Dominican, isn't exactly what employers are looking for. Although it should be, really. I sometimes didn't have enough money for me to eat, let alone a child. What would my parents think? What would my professors in the very traditional St. Ignatius Institute think? Surely all of my Catholic friends would shun me. In that moment, fear soared through my body. Yet, in that same moment, I knew that there was a new living human being inside of me. That God had created this person, and for whatever reason, he entrusted him to me. I already loved him, and I knew I had to do whatever was best for him, and it didn't matter what anyone else thought. One of the first people I confided in was, of course, my best friend, who was married and had a baby just a few months prior. She told me that in her pregnancy research, she read a study that the emotional status of the mother greatly affects the baby developing in her womb and their personality. So even though my baby was conceived in tragic circumstances, I should try to stay as positive, upbeat, and happy as possible, so he will be a happy person. I'm not sure if there is any credence to this, but I believed it. It made sense to me, and I embraced it. Those few words of wisdom influenced the way I viewed my pregnancy and situation, because I truly wanted the best for the child I was entrusted with. I now know it was through the grace of God that she gave me such advice, and that I listened to it, and he was holding me in the palm of his hand. It took me 11 days to tell my mom and dad, even though I talked to them on the phone each of those days. They lived in Spokane, Washington, where I was raised as the oldest of 4 children. My dad was a lawyer, and my mom stayed at home to raise us. I was very close to my mom, and I knew she would be angry and upset. My getting pregnant seemed to be her biggest fear in life, and now I had made it a reality. Worse than upsetting my mom was knowing how much I was about to disappoint my dad. I never considered abortion, but if I had, it would have been to avoid the moment of breaking my parents' hearts. When I finally told them on the 11th day, they were amazing and so supportive. They even cracked jokes, which are our family's way of dealing with difficult moments, and one I approve of. And actually, I had been on the phone with my mom when my roommate, who's one of 13, got a phone call from her family, and I had guaranteed that I would give her the phone when they called for her birthday. So I went to the other line. I told my mom, I have to go, Mom. Kathy's parents are on the phone. And she's like, okay, I love you. I said, no matter what? She said, what's the what? And I said, nothing, just no matter what. And she said, what's the what? And I said, nothing. And she said, is it a good what or a bad what? And I said, it depends on how you take it. And she said, are you pregnant? I said, yes. And she said, you had better call me back when she gets off the phone. So 2 hours later, because she's one of 13 kids, I called my parents back. And my mom said, you know how we're going to Hawaii in 2 weeks, and we were going to take all the booze to Grandma's house so your brothers can't get into it? I'm like, okay. Well, we don't have to anymore. Your father just drank it all. He hadn't really. She was just joking. Anyway, they were 45 years old at the time, and they offered to adopt him themselves, let me move home and transfer to Gonzaga University, where they would help raise him, or provide me with whatever assistance I needed. My mom herself was adopted, and we all met her birth mother and 7 siblings when I was 8 years old. I remember that powerful moment, and for me, I thought it was amazing as I gained this brand new family. This new relationship made me love adoption and gave me a comfort level with this option. I thought it was different, not like everybody else. And I bragged to everyone at school that my mom was adopted. We learned later that her birth mother, my Grandma Jean, had tried to abort my mom 3 times and failed. We all, including my Grandma Jean, thank God that abortion was illegal in 1945, or I wouldn't be standing here before you, nor my siblings and their children, and my loving and generous mother who touched so many lives would never have graced this earth with her presence, and my dad would have been lost without her. Given the circumstances in which I became a mother, there were many others, even pro-lifers, who tried to convince me to have an abortion. I was even called selfish for not having an abortion. When people say they're against abortion except in certain circumstances, I am offended that my child's life is devalued. For me, the question was not whether or not to continue with my pregnancy, but whether to choose adoption or parenting. I was 90% sure from the moment I looked at that test that I would choose the option of adoption. And the other 10% would look for a way to keep him and parent him myself. I had wanted to be a mom from my earliest memories. Like, you know, when you're 6 years old carrying a doll around and you think, maybe they'll think it's my baby. Thinking of how I would parent a child as I grew up myself. It was a strong desire, and now it was about to reach its fulfillment, although not in the circumstances I had envisioned. My initial idea was to go away to a maternity home, place him, and never tell a soul. No one need ever know, but he would live, and he would have a great life. In the past year, several women have confided in me that they made this choice, and it has worked for them. One of my philosophy professors, who had taught me every semester of my college career, mostly in a directed study on St. Thomas Aquinas, go Dominicans, noticed that something was different and called me into his office one evening after class. So I told him what was going on and of my plan and his need to keep this a secret unto his grave. He convinced me to be open, to tell my friends and professors so that they could support me, and mainly to be a great pro-life example on campus. A couple of weeks later, I told my roommates after they staged an intervention because they thought I was suffering from an eating disorder, as they heard me get sick every day. No, that would be simpler. It's called morning sickness, which is a lie. It lasts 24/7, so at least for me. And it's a complication I had badly with all of my children, but they are so worth it. I told the director of the St. Ignatius Institute, Father Robert Maloney, S.J., expecting I may be kicked out of the program or gravely reprimanded. Instead, I was offered so much love and support. He said I could still attend Oxford if I wanted to, even pregnant, possibly knowing I wouldn't choose that option. And he helped me make arrangements with my professors due to my morning sickness. My teachers were all amazingly helpful, which I had not expected. All of my fears about rejection by my parents, professors, peers, and friends couldn't have been more wrong. I was far more loved than I knew. I decided to take the spring semester off college and went home to Spokane. I began to search for a family through an adoption agency, and at first, even though my faith life was extremely important to me, it didn't matter to me what religion this couple was. After looking at couple after couple, through photo albums they put together and letters for my agency, or letters I received almost daily in the mail, I realized it did matter. Not only did I want them to share my faith, but they needed to practice it daily so that my child would grow strong in his faith. I wanted a family who was pro-life, valued education, and was also super fun. I also realized I wanted him to have a stay-at-home mom, which I hadn't intended on being before I got pregnant with Nathan. This combination was difficult to find in 1990. I had been talking to a woman named Joyce, who lived in Chicago, who was friends with one of my roommates, the one that's one of 13 kids. She was a nurse who had an adopted 4-year-old daughter, and she was present at her birth. I loved this idea and the fact that I could choose the family who would raise my child. I spoke with her for hours that fall, and she gratefully answered my questions about pregnancy, adoption, and her own experiences. And it was nice to have an older woman to talk to that wasn't my mom. That February, I decided that I wanted her to adopt my child. I called her and asked if she was willing, and she told me I needed to look at other families first and really know that I wanted her to adopt her. Well, how brave is that, right? So great. So I looked at other families, and I still came back to her. She was delighted, but her lawyer told her there was a 6-month interstate compact with the FBI that needed to be conducted since the baby would be born in Washington and adopted in Illinois. And the baby was due in 3 months from that moment. This meant that I would have to keep him for 2 months, or he would need to live in a home, which would not be emotionally healthy for the baby. I burst into tears, and my dad, who was a lawyer, told me to let him work on it. He did, and he found a way around it the next week. My parents and I decided that my dad would go with me to Chicago to meet them and check them out. And as we were getting into the car to purchase our plane tickets, because there wasn't internet then, it was so hard, wasn't it? The phone rang, and my mom called me back into the house. It was Joyce, and she had news. She had been feeling ill and went in for a battery of tests to see what was wrong. And after 13 and a half years of infertility, she was now pregnant. I congratulated her, and then I burst into tears. I begged her to please still adopt my baby, because, people have twins, and that's two at the same time. So she said she could not, but she would keep her ears peeled for a couple for me. I sat on my dad's lap, 20 and pregnant, and I cried. My dad told me that this was not meant to be. God has a plan, and it's not for Joyce and her husband to adopt my baby. First, he sent the interstate compact our way, but we found a way around it. Now, he created a miracle of a new life in a previously infertile couple. He told me to trust God and his plan, and that he will show it to us. I called the priest who called he called himself my spiritual father. He talked about spiritual fathers today. That night, and asked if he knew of anyone. He flew all over the country leading retreats and surely knew of a good Catholic couple looking for a baby. He said he did not off the top of his head, but he would look for me. I went back to the agency and looked through more albums of couples, but couldn't find any. I thought I might raise him myself, although we would be very poor and he would have no father, which I knew was so important. A week later, Joyce called me with the name of a couple who lived in Maryland, right here, Barry and Liz Sullivan. I asked her to have them write me letters and send pictures, as I knew I would feel too obligated if I talked to them on the phone. An hour after Joyce's call, I kid you not, Father called me with the same name. A couple in Maryland on the other side of the country. Without receiving any letters or pictures yet, I knew my dad had been right, and God had a plan. Oh, there's Barry right now. I received their letters, complete with 32 pictures, and the last was of Barry dressed as the Easter Bunny. I knew that's when you wanted to walk into this talk, Barry. At his church, which meant they were not only Catholic, but fun. They had an adopted daughter who was 5, and I loved that my baby would not be an only child. They flew out to Spokane to meet us, and we clicked. This would be my baby's family. Thy will be done. During the final months, I decided to find out what sex the baby was and learned he was a boy. I had no intention of naming him, as I was giving him to Barry and Liz, and they should name their own son. One afternoon, I found myself in a Catholic bookstore, looking through a big collection of bookmarks. Each had a name and its biblical meaning on it. I looked through the boys' names out of curiosity, and the name Nathan jumped out at me, which was weird because I had never liked that name because there was a boy named Nate in my brother's class who was a bully. So it was kind of tainted. But Nathan means a gift from God. What a perfect name for an adopted child. I tried not to think about it anymore, but it stayed with me all day, and I couldn't get that name out of my head. That night, Barry and Liz called to check in and see how I was doing. I knew I didn't want to suggest a name because they might choose it out of obligation, and I wanted them to freely name him. I asked if they had thought of any names, and Liz replied, "Well, we've been thinking about 2 names, Jason and Nathan." My heart skipped a beat, and I told them about the story that day, and she said, "Then Nathan it is." I was in Spokane, Washington, and they were in Maryland, and we all pondered the same name. The Bible verse from Wisdom that claims, "From your womb I have called you by name. is true. God names each of us before we are born. My parents supported me completely and still offered to adopt or help me with Nathan, but they didn't bring it up. I oftentimes begged them for their opinions, as I wanted to make the best decision possible and often felt like I didn't know what to do. The decision was sometimes overwhelming and could not be delayed. Babies are born on their birth dates. My parents refused to give me their opinions or even a glimpse of what they thought. They knew that it had to be my decision and that had to come from a place of total freedom, the way God created us, or I would never own it as my own. Knowing this, I wouldn't talk to any couples until I knew I might really choose them, as I didn't want to feel obligated. I never allowed Barry and Liz to pay any of my medical or open adoption counselor bills, as I didn't want to feel I owed my baby to them. It had to be as free a decision as possible, and my parents knew this. Years later, as I was attending a Bible study, this topic of freedom came up, and I realized what a sacrifice that must have been. Now that I had my own children, I knew how difficult it was not to offer what they thought I should do, although they helped guide me through all the different scenarios as we made lists of keeping or placing. I called them and thanked them for this gift, and they said they wouldn't have done anything different. This is what the Holy Spirit guided them to do. Now the biggest obstacle facing me was the moment of birth itself. Through my study of St. Thomas Aquinas, the idea that reason and will supersede emotion is what I pondered daily leading up to his birth. I knew my emotions would be overwhelming, and my desire to parent would cause me to think about changing my mind at the moment of his birth. But I also knew that for the sake of Nathan and what was best for him, I would not. What worried me most about his birth was that I would see the pain and suffering of my mom and dad, and being the oldest people-pleasing daughter might change my mind to spare them this pain of loss of their first grandchild. In that moment, there was a miracle. That when I'm doubting the existence of God or going through a dark time, I think back to this moment for proof. The moment he was born, my two girlfriends who were in the room, the doula, the nurses, and the doctor, were all crying. My mom, my dad, and I were all at peace. A peace that was completely supernatural and could be nothing other than the Holy Spirit. It was like the apostles who were in the upper room, filled with angst. And Jesus entered the room and said, "Peace be with you," in the midst of their crisis. We didn't cry, we smiled, and the peaceful presence of God filled the room. It was palpable, and everyone there will never forget that moment. I held Nathan, and my parents doted over him. After a few minutes, my dad calmly asked, "Kathleen, do you want me to go and call the Sullivans and tell them their son is born?" I calmly replied, "Yes." My fears once more had been unfounded. We trusted in God and his mercy, and he saw us through once again. I knew that Nathan was completely intended by God, that I was the vessel who would bring him into this world, and that his parents were meant to be Barry and Liz. The weeks and months that followed his birth weren't always easy, but God's grace continued to direct and guide us. For example, at the advice of my open adoption counselor, and open adoption was very, very new then. I hadn't even heard of it, neither had the Sullivans. I took Nathan home for 6 beautiful days. And my family and friends got to meet him and play a small part in our adoption story. All the neighbors came over and held him. All our friends came over, and my grandma was there every day. At my mother's prodding, we arranged for him to be baptized by our friend and deacon when he was 4 days old. Because my mom said, you can't put a baby on a plane not baptized, right? My adoption counselor suggested we add a handing over ceremony to the baptism. 30 to 40 of our friends and relatives, including my uncle and aunt who drove over from Seattle, attended. Nathan was baptized, and then Barry welcomed all of us into their family and said he was gaining a new set of long-distance relatives. They held true to their promise of exchanging letters, cards, and pictures with whomever desired, and my grandmother took them up on it quite often. They welcomed all of us to visit them in Maryland if we ever had the chance, and my parents did this when Nathan was a boy. I then placed him into Liz's arms, and there was not a dry eye in the house. She placed him right back into mine. She wouldn't hold him during the baptism, or most of the times we were together. I knew she was aware of the tremendous loss I was about to feel and the sacrifice I was making for them, but mostly for Nathan, as I wanted to give him the best life possible. As they boarded the airplane, and you could go to the terminal back then, my mother and brother claimed that the terminal was silent, with all eyes on us. Everyone knew what was happening, and they could see strangers praying. I went back to USF less than 2 months later. I won't say it was easy to place Nathan for adoption. I cried every night in the middle of the night so no one could see. But I stayed positive, I prayed a lot, and I aimed to be that great pro-life example on campus. I went right back to work, school, and was in the fall play and spring musical. I felt supported by my friends and professors, and I learned that an exception would be made and that I would be allowed to attend Oxford University as a senior, since I couldn't my junior year. That spring, Barry called me and begged me to come and stay with them over spring break when Nathan was 10 months old. Open adoption was fairly new, and we were the guinea pigs, and I thought that was the craziest idea ever. I'm like, wouldn't it be too hard for me or for them, for all of us? But he kept begging and insisting, and I agreed. The moment I entered the door to their home, on a cul-de-sac in the beautiful suburban neighborhood of Maryland, you guys had beautiful houses, I gotta say, and saw Nathan playing with his sister and loved by his mom and dad, then I knew that Barry had been right in asking me to come. I knew then with full certainty that I had made the right decision. Barry once said that the reason our story has turned out so beautifully is that we all placed our trust in God and what has always been best for Nathan at the center of our relationship. We were the guinea pigs of open adoption. And while we didn't always know what we were doing or what we would do next, we always trusted in the Holy Spirit would guide us and show us his will, and he has. Having had a sense of closure and peace with my decision, my next challenge was wondering if there would be another chapter of love and life for me with a truly Catholic man. I had thought and still thought about becoming a nun. And my spiritual director said, no way. You're already a mom now, and that drive to parent will be even stronger. I have to admit, my reaction was, whew. Which probably means it wasn't my calling anyway. As I was deciding to place Nathan, I thought I might never get married, that no good Catholic man would want me, and that was okay. 2 weeks after my trip to Maryland, and now completely at peace with my decision, I met the man of my dreams, who is now my husband of over 25 years. He fell in love with me the instant he heard my story. He loved me not in spite of my adoption story, but because of it. The second he heard my story, he said in his mind, if nothing is really bad about her yet that I don't know, I'm going to marry that girl. And then that's when the chase started. Trusting in God once again pulled through, and I have been greatly blessed. Nathan is now 29 years old. He was homeschooled 2nd through 12th grade, started 2 of his own businesses at age 12, landscaping and computer programming and building. He was an Eagle Scout, a National Merit Scholar, not a qualifier or a semifinalist or a finalist, but one of the 1,200 scholars in the country. He attended Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and while there, won the Model Senate for the entire country, portraying Marco Rubio, a great pro-life politician from Florida. He graduated a year early from college and moved to where I live in the San Francisco Bay Area in 2012 to work at a tech company. And so we got to know him a lot better. He taught my own boys, and I have a daughter and then 2 boys, how to build computers, do landscaping, build a shed, replace a roof. He taught them and my husband, and tried but failed to teach me how to scuba dive. He inspired them to join the Boy Scouts so they could be just like their new older brother. And I'm proud to say that they both earned their Eagle Awards. After a couple of years in Bay Area traffic and probably cost of living, he moved back to glorious Florida, where half the country is moving right now, and is now a successful businessman. Inspired by Nathan, both of our boys decided to attend the same university that Nathan attended, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And he still lives in that town, and they see each other all the time. They have this close bond that I would never have imagined. Nathan is now engaged to be married this June, and the story keeps getting better. He has asked both of our boys to be 2 of his groomsmen in his wedding. While his resume is impressive, what is most important is the love he has for all who meet him and his willingness to help anyone at the drop of a hat. His faith is most important in his life, and he is a selfless, strong role model for my children. He loves his new family, and we love him. Placing a child for adoption is not easy, and it is a loss, but it can also be strengthening and life-giving. Through all of my tears missing him, I knew he was alive and leading a great life filled with love. This gave me hope and helped me to carry on. If I had aborted him, as several suggested I should, the loss and guilt would have dug so much deeper. There are no exceptional cases that warrant the taking of another innocent life. To endure a violent act is extremely difficult. Adding the guilt of destroying my own child's life would have burdened me with the grief of guilt and allowed the birth father to not have to accept the consequences of his actions. Motherhood does not mean sacrificing your child so that you can have the life you want, but sacrificing yourself for the good of your child. He and all of my children are not my own. They belong to God and were entrusted to me, and I need to discover his plan for them and trust that all will be well. My faith was strengthened because I trusted in God and said yes to his plan, come what may. My values were defined in looking for the ideal family to raise my son. It made me realize that I should want the same for my own children were I blessed enough to have them. And I knew there was a possibility I would not. I realized that in looking for a husband, He should not just be the best looking and most popular, as I had usually looked for, but he should be the father of my possible future children. He needed to be a strong man of faith who placed his relationship with God first and who wanted to grow in that faith with me. Adoption gave me an incredible new family and mentor for the rest of my life. Barry and Liz frequently email me to thank me to this day, and I ask for their parenting advice for my own children, and we need a lot of it. They're 20, 21, and 24. Those of you who have kids understand. And my kids also look up to them. I think they would listen to Barry more than they would listen to me. Right? My decision led to my husband, whom I love with all my heart, and I thank God for every day to my side. God has used this tragic but grace-filled experience to be of help to others. For example, one of the unexpected results of Nathan's moving to the San Francisco Bay Area in 2012 was the number of friends who confided in me that they had had abortions, some decades earlier. They had not given much thought to what they had done, or they had buried it so they could move on. Once they heard my story, it dawned on them. And then, when they met Nathan in person, they fully realized the weight of their actions. One friend told me through tears streaming down her face that no one told her not to abort her child. She wished someone, anyone, had told her not to, and she wouldn't have. My immediate response to her was that God will forgive her, and so will her child, if she is truly sorry, and she was. I brought her to confession for the first time in 20 years, and she experienced great healing and started attending daily Mass after that. There are resources to help if you are suffering in this way, such as Project Rachel and Rachel's Vineyard. If you are pregnant and in that place of fear, of judgment by your parents, friends, and peers, and of not being able to care for this new life, know that you will be more supported than you expect. If you don't have a supportive family and friends, know that there are agencies, groups, and churches ready to help you with open arms, like Project Gabriel, who will assign you a mentor. Know that adoption is not a decision made out of selfishness, but out of love for your baby, whom God willed into existence. It is chosen not to make another couple's dream come true, although that is a nice side benefit, but to give your baby the best shot at life with a loving and stable family, which one day you may have yourself. Know that adoption is such a better and more healing option than abortion, and there are thousands of amazing couples waiting to love and raise your child and share their life with you. Know that with open adoption, you can choose who raises your child. You don't have to wonder how your baby is doing, and he or she will always know who you are and know that you are special. Your life will go on. You will grow stronger. Your values will be defined, and you will help more along your own path than you may realize. God will be by your side, and he will lead and guide you. He will show you clear signs like I had, if you are willing to look for and acknowledge them. If you know someone who is pregnant, love her, support her, encourage her, pray for her, allow her to make her own decision to parent or place, but graciously accompany her through it. My parents did this amazingly well, and I am forever grateful. Choose life. Choose love. Thank you.
started a abstinence-based sex education program for the public schools back in 1985. And all of us, my 5 siblings and I, we all went to the private school. So it really wasn't her fight.
What was her first name?
Kathleen Folan.
Yeah.
She's 87 years old, and she's still doing it in Florida. And in her county, it's in every secondary and high school in the entire county. And it's going throughout
In the public schools, you
in
said?
the public schools. And in fact, the Diocese of Sarasota donates $20,000 because my mom raises the money privately to get the books for the public schools. Okay?
Wow.
And my point is, had she not done that, we wouldn't have Nathan, because Joyce and her husband wouldn't have been writing this book for my mother. So it was one of those, God rewards you tremendously by getting involved. She didn't do it for that reason, and my first daughter is adopted, and the way we got her is my twin sister volunteered at a pregnancy center in Rhode Island. So, and again, she has 9 children. She had 2 at the time, but she knew that's what the right thing to do was. And God has blessed us so tremendously. Okay, so that's one of the reasons I did my talk, and Kathleen does, the young people. And as far as the Face the Truth tour, I can't tell you the effect it has on young people. I'll just tell you one story. Last year, we were holding the signs, and this day worker had just bought a 12-pack of beer. Okay, it was like 90-some degrees. He came over to one of our high school kids, and we don't collect money. And he gave her like $1.12 in change and said, I admire what you're doing. And I believe that that kid will never question what's my purpose here in life. Okay? She knows what her purpose is, and to have somebody, and the number of people who were positive and said, thank you for being here. I believe you have a moral obligation to get your kids and grandkids, pay them if you have to do it. Because that will be an experience that they will never. 15 years ago, we were out there in Rockford 355, and 7:30 in the morning on a Tuesday, this couple pulled into the parking lot, and I thought, oh my gosh, somebody's going to start yelling at me at 7:30 in the morning. They sat there, they got up, they walked over and said, we just want you to know that she's pregnant, we're not married. We were scheduled for an abortion this Saturday, but because of your pictures, we're not going to do that. Now, if a young person hears that, they're set for life as far as the purpose and the good that they can do. Okay? In my 45 years in the movement, I've never run into someone who was involved whose kids were screwed up on drugs. Now, we're not saints, but they never got into suicide, etc., because they knew what their purpose was in life. And if you want your kids to learn their faith and your grandchildren to learn their faith, you got to twist a few arms, but I got to tell you, they'll always thank you for twisting that arm. Okay, so they can hear a story like Kathy's, and then some people, constantly come up to her and other people and say, I just wish somebody would have said something. And share her story. You can see it'll be on, St. John Neumann already has it on their website from last night's talk. So my twin sister has already shared it on her Facebook. This is a story that I cry every time I sit through, and I live it. And the people are just, sending it around and all that, but we have to go out on a limb, all of us, to everybody we know, and do that. Don't worry about anybody who might be a naysayer. Jesus is watching you, and at the final judgment, he's going to say, why didn't you send that good information around? Why didn't you take a stand? Why didn't you put it on your Facebook page? Okay, as opposed to, you know what, so-and-so made the right decision because they looked at your Facebook page. And it stopped them, and then the people that read it, maybe your relatives don't read it, but they share it to other people, and I assure you, there's a lot of people that are thinking about abortion, and nobody's got the guts to say it's wrong or to bring up because they're worried about, oh, I'm going to look bad, people are going to get but 10 of the 12 apostles were martyred. Martyred. Nobody liked what they were saying. They crucified the Lord because he testified to the truth. We're not called to have a lot of friends. We're called to testify to the truth.
Amen.
Thank you very much.
And the winner of the beautiful wood carving is?
Giselle Coe.
Where's Giselle?
And before we part ways, does anybody have any questions?
Certainly there must be a question or two. Yes.
Let's start with a question that someone asked last night. When did you decide to go public with your story?
Yeah, thanks. I shared my story for the very first time at my parish, at St. Dominic's Catholic Church in San Francisco, at the Vigil for Life, which is the night before the Walk for Life West Coast. And I'm on that committee. It was supposed to be the Sisters of Life speaking, and all of a sudden they couldn't come at our prayer hour after Mass. And so, I don't know, I just asked Father Michael if he would want me to share my story instead, and he said yes. And then I kind of chickened out. I couldn't even speak in a small group like 6 or 7 years ago, like in a Bible study. I just got so nervous, I was trembling. I thought if I breathe, I'll never breathe again. Has anyone ever gotten that nervous? Like, that was me. So public speaking, not my thing. But I felt like it needed to be shared. And also my kids were older. So 3 years ago, my youngest was 17. My kids were 17, 19, and 21. So they were grown. Nathan was grown. It was just the right time. I think the Holy Spirit guided us. I always felt like I should share my story, but I just never could come around to it and didn't know how it would affect my kids or Nathan or anyone else as they were growing up. So now is the time, and they all support it and are proud of it.
Did your kids know the story even though you didn't share it publicly?
Well, they must have growing up.
Yes, they
Well, I know.
always knew who Nathan was. We prayed every night at bedtime, and I lived in Dublin, Ireland for 5 years. The first 5 years of our marriage, we lived in Ireland, and I had 2 children there. At the National Maternity Hospital, which is where James Joyce was born, and it hasn't been remodeled since. But that's what you say. So every night at bedtime, we had this ritual. I read a bedtime story, and then we did the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Glory Be, from birth. And then we prayed for this litany of people in our family, Grandma and Grandpa Taylor, Grandma and Grandpa Folen, and I named all the aunts and uncles and cousins. And I think because we lived abroad, it was super important to name all those people, and Nathan was in that. And then we moved back to America, and Kira was 3.5 years old. And one night, like maybe we'd been back a few months, she said, wait a second, who's Nathan? Because they'd met Grandma and Grandpa Taylor and Grandma and Grandpa Folen and all their aunts and uncles and cousins. And then I had to tell her, I had a baby before I was married, and I didn't know Daddy yet. So I gave him to a really great family. So he would have a mommy and a daddy. And she's like, okay. Like, that was it. So they always knew about him, and he always knew about us. So they didn't know the fullness of the story until they were junior high, probably, or high school. You in the back.
For those people who refuse to listen to God and don't want to go ahead with the abortion, do we have a baptismal ceremony available for term pregnancies, children?
Do we have a baptism available for babies who've been
We're still
aborted?
in utero. We're still in utero right before the abortion.
You can only baptize a baby who's alive. Right, Father?
Outside the womb.
Outside the womb.
Because you have to baptize
Outside,
the baby.
oh, and outside the womb,
Yeah,
okay.
Baby has to have the water on the baby.
Yeah, right. That's the symbolism, right? It's the form, it's the water being poured on the baby.
That's too bad though, isn't it? I mean,
But, well,
so is the baby,
Isn't there baptism by desire?
yeah, I mean, obviously.
I think the church now teaches, correct me if I'm wrong, Father, that the aborted babies do go to heaven.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly it's a baptism by fire. It's like a martyr that gets killed on their way to being baptized. They're dying for the faith. Their blood is considered their baptism. So the baby's blood would be considered its baptism. So we try, what we have to do is put trust in God's hands, right? He knew if the baby was going to be aborted, and he certainly wants the baby in heaven, and it's no fault of the baby it wasn't baptized. But you have to baptize. It's like if you don't have wheat bread and you decide to use rice bread, it's not Jesus, right? So you have to baptize the baby because that's the symbolism, the form of how the person's sin is taken away.
And I know that our archdiocese in San Francisco, and I'm sure they probably have it out here too, they're now having a memorial service every year for babies lost from miscarriage or stillbirth or abortion.
Right.
That is healing for a lot of people too. You had a question in the front row.
Someone did.
Just a question, no, I'm going to make a statement. My best girlfriend, she had 3 daughters, and they're now 52, 51, 49. But I took them to one pro-life thing when they were teenagers. There's one. And all 3 of them got pregnant before they were married. The first one told her mother, and her grandmother figures her grandmother, and they kept insisting that she had abortion, she didn't. So the other 2 didn't tell them until they were getting ready to go to the hospital to have the baby. They just never, they never showed. It was always like, so they never told them, but, and they always said that. But on Ruth took us to that thing, that's still your baby. So even if it's just one time, and they were teenagers, and that happened, they got pregnant later, like 3 years after I'd taken through this rally. So, teenagers just listen to what you say. You'd be surprised. No, you might act like you don't.
Beautiful. Thank you for being that witness for them. And you saved 3 lives by bringing them to that rally.
Remember what the rally was?
Congratulations.
But I remember it was downtown in the Civic Center, so you know how long that goes. I didn't call it Civic Center anymore, but it was down there.
Downtown Baltimore.
Oh, wow. Beautiful. Thank you.
The environment in San Francisco must be pretty rough for, for your work for pro-life and just, maybe it's not, maybe I'm wrong, but I just can imagine that it would be hard.
Yeah, I know that at the first Walk for Life, some really bad things happened that I won't even mention. There are some evil people there that were on the other side, like having sex in front of everybody as we walked by and then throwing it into the crowd, like just nasty, nasty stuff. And now we have 60,000 people there, 60,000, and they only have like 100. So they'll just keep walking along with us, and we've never fought back. That's always been our policy: do not engage with them, do not be violent. And so they just kind of gave up, and we outnumber them, and we don't engage with them. So, but overall, it's hard being conservative in San Francisco, but you find your friends and you cling to them, and we support each other, and it's good. We try to be a role model and try to open up dialogue with people. They're not always willing to listen, but sometimes they do. You never know. You in the back.
I'm sure you have, but do you know approximately how many babies you saved that people have gotten in touch with you? Feedback?
Do I know how many babies I've saved?
Uh-huh.
I have no idea. I hope I've saved babies. I do know that last year after the Walk for Life, and that was so scary because I told you I was terrified of public speaking, and this was to 60,000 people, plus live on EWTN. No pressure. My friends in Ireland even watched it, so they showed it in Europe too.
Nathan was there.
And Nathan spoke after me. Yeah, I introduced Nathan, so that was really, really powerful. But I know that the next day I got a text from a friend of a friend, would I talk to this girl who was pregnant through rape and had an abortion scheduled that Saturday? And I said I would, but I also knew a lot of people reach out to me and I say, of course I will, and the girls never call me. Like, they're just in their own place. So I said, you can give her this article, and it was a LifeSite News article written, I think, by Barry's friend, about our talk. And it had the speech in it, a video of the speech. I said, just give her this, and then I gave her some words of wisdom. She canceled the abortion. So I know at least her.
Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
I guess I want to encourage you to continue to speak out on this. From my own personal experience, my mother became pregnant when she was in college. She was in an Ivy League school, the first one in the family to go to college. And the entire family wanted her to abort, and she put her foot down. And so I have that story, and my 5 children have that story. And so while we don't have your platform by any means, and we certainly don't deserve your platform, we don't have anything like your story, it's those personal stories that when my kids share it with their friends, it has such impact. So if you have those kinds of stories, you know, it took me years before I was allowed to talk about that because my mom was, you know, good Catholic girl, it's 1969, you're not supposed to be getting pregnant out of wedlock kind of a thing. But, you know, time has gone on, my mother gave me permission. So when you have those stories, it's those personal stories that really make a lot of difference. So I don't know how you can increase the number of people who know about you. I'm active in the pro-life movement. I hadn't heard about you before. I'm thankful that I came here today. So just whatever you guys need to do to increase your story, it's so powerful, and it will definitely change minds and hearts.
I think that was what I was saying. Share it. If you have a Facebook page, just share it. Just say, please watch this video with people, because you're absolutely right. In the 30 years I've been speaking for Defend Life, it's the stories that win people's hearts. And when I first heard as I lived this story, I'm like, people just won't believe all the things that went together, the miracle that happened is just unbelievable. I'm still, again, I get tears in my eyes. And when we, and she may not know this, when we first went out to meet Kathy's family, we went back to the hotel, and my wife actually was like, what if she decides we're not a couple? And I said, now, in my family, other siblings, which I won't go into why, have adopted children and had lost some adoptions. Like they felt it was the last second the birth mother decided to keep the child. And I said, we don't get Nathan, that's God's will. For whatever reason, God doesn't want us to have Nathan. It's that simple. And that's always been my belief in life, just like Kathy. That way, you're thankful when things go well, but it's when things don't go well that I think people are looking at us for our faith. You know, when things are going well, it's easy to be a good Christian. When you lose a loved one, when you get cancer, etc., then I think people are really looking at you, especially non-Catholics, are going, what is really making them tick? And if you're not always, like Kathy said, faith or the reason and the will, then you're making decisions like this. But if you do the will and the choice and put God's hand, then no matter what happens, you're like, okay, you've given me this, now let's move forward to the next day. And it's a great way to live. Because when people say, well, we're not changing hearts. We are changing hearts. But you know what? They said that about Mother Teresa too, and at the final judgment, God's not going to say, did you change America? He says, did you testify to the truth? Heck, they crucified him. And he was God, and he was raising people from the dead, raising the sick, and all that. We can't do that. So we should expect to catch a little flack, but there's many stories that hear Kathy, and they come up. And you know what? And they, just like you shared your story, there's more stories out there than you'll ever know. And this gives people the opportunity to bring it to the forefront and win other people over with their stories. Okay? So never think that you don't have a big platform. If you talk to one other person, you have a big platform. That's one soul you can save.
And this very talk that's being given right now is being videotaped and it will be posted within the next day. So go to defendlife.org and there it is, and you can share it with the world.
But I would also say, don't discredit your own story. Like 5 years ago, I didn't think, I'm like, who would even want to hear my story? Like, it's not that great. It's not like I was sitting on an abortion table about to get an abortion and I changed my mind. Like, it's not like one of those stories. And everything turned out so well and it's almost too great. And so I discredit my own story. So I wouldn't discredit your story. You might have an incredible story, and your mom too, you know, and you taking the 3 girls who chose life because you took them to that rally. I mean, they're all incredible stories. So I think if you're willing to share your story, the platform will present itself if God wants it. So I happen to be on the Walk for Life West Coast Committee in San Francisco because, as you can imagine, there aren't very many of us conservatives and pro-lifers. So that was how Ava, who also works at Ignatius Press, knew me. But she also didn't push it. She didn't ask me for a few years if I would be willing to share my story. So the timing was just right.
Tell us about some of the other good things that are going on in San Francisco, like the Carmelite Monastery, your large young adults group.
Oh.
Father Fesio, the great things he has done.
So Jack wants me to talk about great things in San Francisco. So I was in the St. Ignatius Institute, which I don't know if you all know that. It's a great books program at the University of San Francisco that was founded by Father Joseph Fesio, who also founded Ignatius Press, if you guys have heard of Ignatius Press.
And Ave Maria University.
And Ave Maria University, yeah, so all around the same time. The Ignatius Press, the St. Ignatius Institute was closed, of course, because the USF Jesuits didn't like the St. Ignatius Institute Jesuits. So it only lasted 25 years, but it was amazing, and that's where my husband was also in it. My husband's a doctor, and he shot straight to the top in leadership, and I swear it's because of his great books background and his classical education that teaches you how to think and how to relate to people. We also have the Walk for Life West Coast, as you know. I'm at St. Dominic's Catholic Church in Pacific Heights, which the West Coast Dominicans right now, OP West, are amazing. Super solid, devout Catholics, and they're all younger than me, which gives us hope, right? Like my pastor's younger than me and all the other priests that are on our staff. The Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology at Berkeley is amazing, and they are teaching solid philosophy and theology and Catholicism. And then we have a great young adults group. That's what Jack is all excited about. We have about 400 members of our young adults group, but I think there's 1,600 on the Facebook page or something. And they come from all over to go to our young adults group. And it's been going for over 35 years, strongly. And what they do is the leaders, the young adults lead it. So they pick the topics every Wednesday night. Then they go out for beers afterward. Or they'll go to the young adults mass. We have 7 or 8 masses on every weekend. So the 5:30 p.m. is the contemporary choir. And they'll go to that one and then go out to dinner afterward. A lot of socializing. They go to Yosemite for a weekend to go camping together. Yosemite's beautiful too. They have to reserve it a year in advance, of course. So there are awesome young adults in that group, and most of them are pro-life, and they were the ones that filled our 40 Days for Life. They're all like in their 20s, and they usually find their spouses within that group too. There are a lot of marriages, and they teach for me. So I run family and youth ministries, and I get a lot of my catechists, my volunteer catechists from them, which is awesome to have, especially my middle schoolers, to have great Catholic young adults in their 20s as their role model, and they relate to them way more than me. Like, I'm a mom, I'm old. So, yeah, that's what's going on. We have a lot of good things. We have some good parishes, and we have an awesome Archbishop, Cordeleo. Thank God. People have taken out full-page ads protesting against him, but still he is there and he's still doing great work. So thank God we have him. Thank you.
This partially repaired, let's give him a